Welcome everyone, you're listening to The Party Line, a podcast from The Ditch, news and comment from Ireland on theditch.com. I'm Niamh Bhriain.
And I'm Paulie Doyle from The Ditch. Follow The Party Line on social media and follow The Ditch on social media as well, please. Because your complaints have been heard, we're after getting rid of Harry. It's just going to be Niamh and I co-hosting this, but we are today joined by two esteemed guests, Patrick Bresnihan and Pat Brodie. Welcome to The Party Line, guys. It's great to have you. How are you guys doing?
Pretty good, yeah. Thanks for having us.
We're going to be talking a little bit about all the great work that you've done, the book that you've co-authored, From the Bog to the Cloud, and we're going to be talking a little bit about FDI, nationalism, this term that you've coined. So before we do that, though, I think we're going to have a little bit of a chat about what's in the ditch.
Yeah, so maybe, Paulie, you can tell us what two articles you've picked out for this week to discuss on the podcast.
Well, the first one is to do with the Department of Enterprise and figures that were, previously published in more detail than they had been published. So, military export licenses, which entitle Irish companies to export dual-use or military goods to various different countries. There is a report that comes out every year that was breaking it down country by country so that the public could have a kind of very clear picture of where these goods were going. Mm-hmm. The 2024 report, they stopped doing that, though. You just got the total figure. So we got our hands on a breakdown of the places that they were going, and it turned out that, we'd seen a spike in the value of these export licenses to Germany and to the US, the biggest suppliers of Israel. And the total amount, the total value of these export licenses had increased from 183 million to about 225 million between 2024 and 2025. So a pretty steep increase and reflective of kind of where the economy is going.
Yeah.
You know?
And I had been looking at these reports. So a few years back, I was looking at the question of Irish complicity in genocide. And so it's the same report that has the dual use goods and the exports of those, and the exports under the military licenses. And just on the military licenses, like you're talking about, for example, components for bombs, torpedoes, missiles, like it's not kind of soft stuff we're exporting. And I think a lot of people don't actually realise the extent to which Ireland is actually exporting military grade equipment. And as we were able to find out with the Ditch article, we have continued to export, I think it's up to 16 million that we have exported, and you can correct me on the figure, Paulie, that Ireland has exported in military equipment to the US since it has started the illegal bombing of Iran. So, we're continuing to export this military equipment, but also Israel is armed by the US and Germany. They're almost 100% of Israeli arms are supplied by the US and Germany. And those two countries happen to be the two countries that we are exporting the most of our military licensed equipment to. And then, Paulie, one of the things that came back in the correspondence you had was the end user agreement.
Yeah, there's so if the product is being incorporated into something else and then going on to be used by, another entity or a person, the companies only have to say where that information is known. So it's very, very difficult for us to actually figure out who the ultimate end user of a lot of these goods are.
Yeah. And so maybe just there's a factory in Ireland, and also that's another thing. We have no idea which companies are involved because the department doesn't release any information whatsoever about which companies are involved. So imagine there's a factory somewhere in Ireland that's producing components for bombs. They export those components to the US. They're then fitted into the bombs in the US, and then they are transported to Israel and dropped on Palestinians. There's an awful lot of questions to be asked there, and there's no answers coming back about whether Ireland is exporting military licensed equipment to Israel's biggest arms suppliers, and whether that equipment is then ending up being used to bomb Palestine, now to bomb Lebanon, potentially to bomb Iran also.
just because it's somewhat relevant, I told you, Niamh, about these 3 reports that I got from AFRI that were on the arms industry in Ireland. So these 3 reports that AFRI commissioned, one in 1996 was the Lynx report, and then 2 were in, I think, 2001, 2002. They came out those 2 years. And as far as I know, those are the last reports about the arms industry and dual-use goods in Ireland. That's 25 years. So the work that Ditch is doing is amazing. But to think how much that has advanced in 25 years, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, and that we don't have, scrutiny on it. We don't have information about it. I think AFRI are looking to commission another report on it. But it is a serious piece of work. And it would be much harder to follow those supply chains, I would imagine now, because of the nature of dual-use goods and so on, and these various different countries and so on. But so important.
Yeah. But even if you watch, there's a webinar you can watch on the department's website, and it's all about how they will do business responsibly. So they say that the licensing is not to hinder trade, it is to do trade responsibly. But what is responsible about trading military-grade equipment with a country that is like the US or Germany that have been backing, arming, now perpetrating actively illegal wars and genocide? So is that responsible? In whose head is that responsible?
It's kind of just in general how they tend to hide behind the economy as something, right? Where it's like, this is just good trade, this is good business, this is just us, sort of developing or protecting our, kind of like national economic interests through, being a part of these supply chains, right? And in the way where it's really hard to get economic data in general, right? We found this when we were with the price prosperity report, where it was trying to get the data on, for example, what goods Ireland was trading with Israel. In particular, that data is not really publicly available, right? It's very difficult to, we have to do a lot of working backwards through the data that is available to kind of like deduce these things, right? So yeah, I think in general, these things are so the supply chain organization makes it really, really hard to track, injustices along it, right?
By design.
Exactly, right? Yeah.
But there was another story, Paulie, that was also about Israel and Israeli settlements that maybe you can tell us a bit about.
The Green Party candidate, by-election candidate for Galway West, a guy called Niall Murphy, well, he's got shares in Cisco, which he bought at a discount being an employee there, and Cisco has operated in, provided technology to illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank and in the Golan Heights. I suppose there were questions as to whether owning those shares, having a financial stake in that company, is, in contradiction to the Green Party's stated policies on Israel and, the genocide it's committing.
Yeah, and there were some quotes in that article as well from him that were bizarre. Kind of I don't know if you have it with you, but the quotes, like his kind of response that he might, I think was that he might consider shifting course if he got elected, or so. I can't remember exactly.
It's also that first quote where the article starts and he says, he almost frames it as being a victim of Ireland's position in the world system, right? Where he's like,
They were
look,
throwing
we're all
the shares at me.
Exactly, right? Yeah, there's a little bit of a, he was clearly trying to head this off a little bit in a way that, he's acknowledging that there's these complicities in participating in a system of, let's say, by getting shares in a company that you work for, right? In Ireland where, the economy is, especially with tech and stuff, is tied up in these supply chains and these kinds of financial networks. And he's trying to head that off in a way, right?
Yeah. So, I'll read the quote to you and we'll see exactly, and you guys can respond to it. So he says, what I have is a microcosm of the national indebtedness, if you like, to foreign direct investment. We're kind of held hostage a bit to all these multinationals because we've got this huge tax take from them. So nationally, we are compromised by all of these companies.
It's kind of like, God love me, I got
what was
these
I
shares.
supposed to do?
But
I don't know. And I think there is a distinction between somebody selling their labour to one of these companies that are operating in Ireland, as opposed to having a financial stake in that company, owning shares, the value of which was enough that he had to declare them when he was a councillor previously, because it gives you a financial stake in that company, and it's the value of those shares is going to be linked to these operations in Israel and in the West Bank and in
Cisco specifically a BDS target, or at least
Yes.
it's been mentioned, by BDS, and it's there was report I was actually reading when looking at your article. I was going, looking at Cisco's particular investments, and they've been named specifically as service providers for military operations, right? In the Israeli military apparatus, right? So they are a majorly named complicit company, right? So it's there's a particular stake there.
They launched a platform in October 2023 called, I think, Israel Rises, and it was specifically to assist cross-industry collaboration to help the Israeli military as it was embarking on, its attacks on Gaza. So it's directly involved in all of this.
Yeah.
It's up to his eyes in it. So that was what was in the ditch this week.
Very good. Thanks, Paulie. So now we will move on, as we do every week, and we look at our non-ditch media piece, which this week is from Le Monde.
Well, you guys had some experience with the journalist in question, so why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so basically, Le Monde has a piece that came out, I'm not actually sure of the date that it came out on, called Ireland, the weak link in Europe's defence by Cécile Ducourteau. I'm hopefully pronouncing that correctly.
Good enough.
So basically, Cécile got in touch with us. So we noticed this piece in Le Monde because we're in it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, we were approached, Paddy and myself, at the end of February by this journalist from Le Monde. She is French, but she's based in London, and she was in Ireland doing a story. The week that she happened to be here, so she was here for an entire week. She was in Cork first, then in Dublin. And the week that she happened to be here was basically a kind of a before and after for Irish foreign policy and Irish security or defence policy, because it was the week that Ireland launched its national maritime security strategy, first time ever, where we basically say that we will now form bilateral agreements with Britain and France, both nuclear powers, to allow them to patrol our waters. We will engage the Joint Expeditionary Force. We will spend all of this money building a new kind of maritime security strategy for the country. So it was basically a before and after moment for Ireland. It was also the week that we heard about the 2 billion euros of an arms deal with the French, most of that will go to KNDS, the French arms company that's part of the Irish Security and Defence Association, which we discussed on our first podcast.
Yeah.
And it was also the week that Micheál Martin said on record in the Doyle that Ireland can militarily align with Ukraine and also be militarily neutral, which are opposing positions. That's just not possible. So it was quite a week that this French journalist happened to be here. She got in touch with a number of sources. So, Paulie, maybe you can mention the different sources.
Oh, yeah. So a naval officer, a retired admiral, a guy from the IIEA, Cathal Berry, Ed Burke, and Niall O'Connor from the Journal. So a variety of perspectives and opinions included in this, and you guys as well.
And us too, yeah. The article it's a long read piece, and I think we're just going to go through different parts of it because it's really quite telling. I think so there's a statement kind of maybe a third of the way in where it says that Dublin appears to have become a target of Russian hybrid operations. Incidents have multiplied since 2022. Now, do we have any evidence for even one Russian hybrid operation in Ireland? And then when she says incidents have multiplied since 2022, what she's talking about in 2022 is when there was the Russian ship off the Irish coast that was carrying out naval exercises in international waters. I think they were first in Irish waters and then they were relocated to international waters because of diplomacy. There was basically diplomatic engagement. She doesn't talk about that. She classifies that as an incident, and then the Dublin kind of appears to have become this target of Russian hybrid activity. And then she goes on to say the most recent alert was when drones were spotted on the flight path of Russian President Vladimir Zelensky's plane as he arrived in Dublin on an official visit in December 2025. Now, again, there is no evidence that there were any drones in the flight path. There have been requests that the alleged footage of those drones would be released. There's no evidence.
So, yeah, the state has tried to say that, well, this matter is being investigated by An Garda Síochána, so it would be inappropriate for us to comment on it. But to my knowledge, nobody has even confirmed, the existence of this footage. And it was incredible to see, all of the reporters fall into line when this happened, to push this idea that we're under siege or we're under threat from Russia. And if you look back and read the reporting, it's replete with things like, it is believed that this could possibly be Russia, or it is thought, it is rumoured. There's no concrete evidence whatsoever, but yet the public was told, no, we're getting attacked by Russian drones, so we're going to have to tool up. Otherwise...
But just in my exchange with this French journalist that was in Ireland, Cécile, I sent her well-researched pieces of journalism. One was from a Dutch media outlet called Trouw. Another was from the Belgian Flemish language media outlet called NRC. And they both did really good journalism, basically, looking at the alleged drone sightings in various locations around Europe. And they found that they weren't actually drones at all, that there was, in one case, it was a helicopter. In another case, it was a star. But on the basis of these falsehoods, we are reorientating our security policy. So if there is, evidence that there were drones, it would be great to see it, and then we can talk about that. But what we do have are two pieces of really good journalism that actually show with facts and figures that at the time of the alleged drone sighting that shut down Brussels airport, it was actually a police helicopter, for example. So I sent her that, kind of, encouraging her to look at those links in the framing of the Dublin alleged drone sighting off the coast of Dublin. But none of that makes its way into this piece. The framing of it is very much a framing that, like it says here, for example, in light of Ireland's lacklustre response, its European partners have grown impatient. Like, it's kind of Ireland is an embarrassment, and Europe is kind of growing impatient with us now, and we kind of need to, pull ourselves together and listen to these expert security analysts and specialists and pull our weight.
You could teach this article in a journalism class as an example of somebody putting their fingers on the scales. I mean, it's very clear what the reporter's opinions are, and that she just engaged with you guys to tick a box. So if anybody accused her of impartiality, she could say, no, I had all perspectives. I mean, it was quite telling who is an expert and who is a specialist, and who got labelled an activist and a young woman.
Yeah. And maybe, Paddy, you can talk a little bit about the specialist expert side of things.
Yeah.
You were caught up in that, well, as was I, but maybe you want to talk a bit about it.
Well, there's a couple of things to come to mind. It's like the consultative forum in 2022 in terms of stacking this supposedly open process to debate Ireland's sort of foreign policy, defence and security in a kind of an open way, but it's full of experts that have one opinion. Yeah. And maybe I think there was just one person that was known as an advocate. Who was it again?
There was somebody from PANA.
Yeah.
And there was also Ray Murphy who's been a long-time supporter of keeping the triple.
But we constantly hear this line about, we need an open debate about defence and security. And a bit like this journalist coming to Ireland to get a sense of all of the varied opinions about neutrality. When she emailed me, that was the email. She said, I really want to understand why this question of neutrality is so contested. So she came, but she only, she didn't just talk to, but she only heard a very select set of perspectives that really sort of verified or reflected her existing biases, what she already thought. And when she came to talk to you and I, and you said you sent her sources, so you did work for her. She didn't need to do that work. You sent her those sources, which is what she as a good journalist should be doing herself. I also was happy to send her sources, and I referenced lots of things, but she didn't include that. Yeah. So it's this idea of, like, particularly when it comes to this question of neutrality and defence and security, the idea of balance, or the idea of some kind of open debate, it just doesn't exist. If it was about another issue like housing, if it was about energy, if it was about like agriculture or food policy, there would probably be a more sort of balanced inclusion of opinions. But when it comes to this issue, it's so frustratingly and worryingly closed and narrow. And this article basically just reproduces that. And I just feel bad because I thought she was maybe a bit different, not being Irish to start with. So I thought maybe she's coming with a genuinely open mind. You know, we met in Bang Bang in Phibsborough, and she was like, oh, I was here last year because I did a piece on Bohemians and what a great football club they were. So I thought, oh, here's a kind of a cool French journalist with an open mind. And we spent an hour, and it really felt like she was listening. And then what she put in there that I said was not just taken out of context, which of course can happen, you know, you get quotes, but the way she undermined both of us with this labeling of young woman, in your case, an activist in both our cases, it seems so obvious and deliberate. And then we both emailed, she responded to both of us in the same thread. And she made some kind of deflection that maybe it was a translation, that in French activist meant something different, and that we were basically misunderstanding. But then the question is, why didn't you use activist for Ed Burke or Cian Fitzgerald or any of the other people that you quoted who have very strong opinions and are constantly platformed in our media espousing those opinions?
And there in the piece, all of the military personnel that she contacted and referenced, and the experts or the specialists like Ed Burke or Cian Fitzpatrick or Fitzgerald, they're referred to as experts, specialists. You know, they're given a professional kind of recognition and title.
Niall O'Connor is called a specialist.
He's called a specialist as well. But in our case, Paddy was. Do you want to?
I was given the thing professor of geography in Maynooth and a pro-neutrality activist. Right. So it kind of defaulted that. But
and then in my case, I was called just called an activist, which I am, but I presented myself to her as, you know, a researcher with Transnational Institute. I said I had participated in, you know, committees before the Oireachtas as an expert witness or whatever. But she left out all of that and just kind of had her tick the box. I spoke to an activist, me, and then she writes that I felt betrayed. So in the cases of everyone else, it's kind of they've done this analysis and produced these well-argued facts and figures and reports, evidence-based. And then she speaks to me and she says that I feel betrayed. So it's about how I feel. And then she says, this is a quote from me, nobody wants the country to be embroiled in wars, said the young woman. So I'm the only woman she spoke with. She didn't attribute gender or age to any of the men that she interviewed. But to me, I was the young woman who felt betrayed.
It's condescending, I mean, to you and to you as well, but like, it's also condescending about Ireland as well. There's lines in the piece where it's like, oh, they're so attached to it. God bless them.
Yeah, because it goes on.
They just love that neutrality, even their love for it just against all the reality of how the world is today. They just won't get rid of it for whatever reasons.
Because it goes on from there. So it goes on from poor me feeling betrayed to the population remains strongly attached to neutrality. Yeah. So instead of framing neutrality as a legal construct that's anchored in international law, it's this kind of attachment that we have to this aloof kind of idea of, you know, neutrality. And then she goes on to say, direct quote, in the autumn of 2025, they even elected Catherine Connolly, a far-left, pro-neutrality and anti-militarist politician, as their new president. So it's the word even. Like that these people even elected this far-left, pro-neutrality president.
But there's also, it's the echo chamber thing, right? So she came here for a week and she talked to, 6 or 7 people. But she clearly read what is in the national media here about neutrality and Catherine Connolly, for example.
And each of those people, or at least several of those people I know, have been publicly
Against Catherine Connolly.
Against Catherine
Yeah.
Connolly, exactly.
So
yeah.
she either read those or she used some kind of technology to condense those views into a written format. But it's just so much a repetition of what we have been giving out about and frustrated by for 2-3 years. Like what she should have done, what I would have liked to have read is for her to take this 71% of people who support enshrining the principle of neutrality in the Constitution, and if she'd come to Ireland to try to understand that. So why is it that 71% of people are remain committed to neutrality, despite the fact that we have a parade of so-called experts and politicians telling us that this is immature, emotional, that we need to grow up? That would have been an interesting article. But instead she gives it one line, and if I was a reader of Le Monde, I would be like, oh, what the hell? You know, that doesn't seem to tally with the 5 people that you've quoted. So there's something there which is not just about, you know, as Paulie said, being patronizing. It's that she has clearly missed the bigger part of the story here, you know.
But it's also, it's not even like patronizing. There's also like a pathologizing of it, right? It's that this is an this kind of irrational affliction that the Irish people have, right? And again, it's attachment, right? And it's related to the, you know, the serious guy stuff, right? It's that, you know, we need to grow up, all these things, right?
Yeah.
And it's also, you know, I think the opening or, you know, sort of early invocation that she has of this defense spending, right? You know, Ireland has this low defense spending, right? Which is also this economic argument that is being peddled by European experts who are, you know, who she's invoking, saying, oh, everybody's getting impatient with Ireland, right? So it's also this economic argument that is being tied to where, like, this growing up also needs to come with developing a military economy, right? You know, grow up and become like the rest of us and, you know, develop this, you know, military economy, right? Which is, and again, it's just the way that she invokes that. So as a kind of background ideological commitment, right, is, again, it's irresponsible, right? You know, beyond anything else, right?
Yeah.
That's a good segue, I think, to talk about the book that you guys have written, From the Bog to the Cloud. So tell us about, I mean, how it came about, first of all, and maybe the term FDI nationalism and how you came up with that too.
Sure. Well, the book, so Pat and I met, I think, around 2019. Our mutual friend, colleague, Phil Lawton, put us in touch. And it was around our shared interest in data centers. So 2019, you know, data centers were kind of appearing in the media. You know, there was a sense that this was a growing sector and that they used energy. But there hadn't been very much research or analysis of what was happening and why there had been this sudden growth. So Pat and I met, and that was our initial sort of conversation starter. And then the book grew from this question of why are there so many data centers in Ireland to needing to understand the nature of Irish capitalism and post-colonial development. So it grew into a much bigger book. And the book itself is quite historical. You know, it goes back to, well, there's a short bit which is like pre-independence, but most of it follows from 1922 up until the present, and trying to understand these different sort of stages, I guess, of development and how that helps us understand where we are today with this, you know, seemingly very wealthy country with these huge corporation tax receipts, but a very underdeveloped infrastructure for social provision, for public provision. So that's it kind of in a nutshell. And then this term FDI nationalism, I think you actually, we sent you the book to have a look at, and the thing that you said in a response was, I really like this term FDI nationalism.
Yes.
And I think that when we came up with it, and still in the book, it's kind of a casual, not a casual, but it's like an aside. It's not like a central concept in the book. But I think since we finished the book and since things have been happening in the last couple of years, it's something that we come back to a lot. And we've had to think through it more about what it means and about how it might help us understand stuff that's happening now. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, because I mean, I think the other thing that it comes up in relation to is, and like part of the reason the book is so historical is because part of the point of it is to trace this Ireland's relationships of dependency in the world system, right? You know, where it's this, you know, obviously after the 1950s, Lemass and Whitaker, right? Ireland becomes economically much more strongly linked to the U.S., right? In part as a way to, at least in a sense, finally break with this, post-colonial dependency on Britain, right? There'd obviously been these like trade wars and things, or trade conflict between Ireland and Britain in the, at least the Free State Britain in the immediate post-independence period. And then also sort of following the winds, right, of the way the world system was changing, which is, sort of growing U.S. hegemony in the post-World War II era, right? So there's this sort of, obviously, there's kind of a moment that you can trace Ireland's, economic dependency to, again, this doesn't really take off and, sort of develop in the way that we kind of know it here today until, late 80s, 90s, right, with the IFSC, right, sort of obviously becoming this financial hub. But then where Paddy and I sort of take it is looking at infrastructure, right, looking at, for example, Intel being this moment. And Intel was extremely important in, when they kind of landed this plant in the late 80s, to locate Intel manufacturing in Leixlip. This was seen as, not only a success of the model, but it was also seen as kind of saving it, right? Because there'd been a lot of discussion in the early 80s basically saying this wasn't working, right? This sort of open economy, industrialization by invitation, there was, still massive amounts of outward migration, there was economic stagnation, various financial crises, sort of over and over again. And when Ireland managed to land, or the IDA and the government managed to land Intel, this was sort of seen as the saving moment. And the thing with Intel was that it was, not only was Leixlip going to become a company town, which it still kind of is for Intel, but it was developing the infrastructure, providing, favorable tax rates, obviously, which they were doing for other companies as well. And also, providing the kind of groundwork, right? Dennis O'Hearn, who's a political economist that we rely on a lot in the book, kind of for a lot of the historical work, points out that the government was paying something like 100,000 punts per job created by the Intel facility, right? Which is an enormous amount of investment into basically making this model work, right? Which again, is quite, important. This is sort of the Irish economy as we know it. But we were interested in that, sort of tracing that as a kind of prehistory of, something like data centers being here in Ireland, and where, that was kind of where the book ended up taking after this initial interest, was sort of trying to find what the root of this is, right? Both in terms of the institutions of the state, the infrastructures, as well as, with FDI nationalism, this kind of ideology that sort of permeates these various institutional mechanics of the Irish state, in these different ways that I think, we still see, and obviously quite strongly in, a lot of Ireland's remaining and probably deepening dependencies, right, at the minute.
Was it Michael Noonan who said that the FDI model was sacrosanct? Which politician was that?
I can't remember.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But just to go back, because we didn't exactly explain what FDI nationalism means, I think that where the kind of catch is, or why it's important, is that it's like the resource nationalism that you see in other post-colonial countries. So often there is a resource that forms the economic base of that development model. So it maybe is oil in Nigeria, for example, or gas in Venezuela, or it's usually some kind of hydrocarbon or some kind of mineral. But that resource, because of the nature of an underdeveloped former colony, it becomes reliant on exporting or possibly processing this particular resource. In Ireland, we don't have a resource. We have land, but we don't have a large quantity of a valuable sort of resource that can be a commodity. What we do have is foreign direct investment. So the idea of FDI nationalism is that Ireland from the 50s onwards became incredibly good, or the state became incredibly good at attracting and keeping foreign direct investment. And what that meant was a whole set of investments by the state, not just financial, but in terms of how departments of enterprise was focused, the semi-state, so IDA, but also we talk about Bord na Móna, Cuilche, the university system, so third level, how all of these institutions become geared towards this task of attracting and keeping FDI. And then that becomes our base. which means that it also is somewhat like unquestionable, not just at an economic level, but culturally and ideologically. So, Pat was making this point earlier that, like, even where you could say Nigeria, the oil industry is destroyed, the Niger Delta, and has been terrible in terms of how it's corrupted institutions and so on. In a sense, the economy still relies on that resource. And so you can't just say we're not going to utilize that resource anymore. What you could have is a debate over like how the distribution of those resources are going to happen. You see something similar with FDI in Ireland, even though we can point out, and maybe we'll get to this, say, with the price of prosperity, the contradictions of this model. You wouldn't find many people who would say we need to stop our reliance on foreign direct investment because of the economic opportunities and benefits which are undoubtable, and we still rely on it. So there is this way in which it's ideological, but it's also a very material thing. It's baked into the kind of structure of the Irish economy and has been for 60, 70 years.
Yeah. Let's talk about how this links in with neutrality and the ongoing efforts to degrade and diminish it and to transform the economy into a militarized one. So what is it about this model that that's become a pressure point that could be used to push us towards militarization?
I mean, it's the infrastructure, I think, is at least one of the strongest arguments when it comes to FDI, right? And this was sort of referenced in the Le Monde article, right? About the exclusive economic zone and, the amount of these cables, that are, that Ireland needs to protect, and again, we need to grow up and, do our part, whatever, which again is obviously a complete red herring, right? You cut one of these cables and latency drops for like, 30 minutes and, it reroutes and it's all fine, right? It's completely, again, a sort of ideological discursive argument more so than anything that's actually rooted in, the technical character of, protecting infrastructure, right? But then the other side of it as well is the data centers, right? At the very least in our, as the kind of most recent and probably intensive instantiation at the minute, right, is, in terms of infrastructure, they're very... this gets thrown out as rendering Ireland, vulnerable to cyber attacks, to sabotage, to whatever, right? The enemies of Ireland's allies, and the services and industrial processes that Ireland hosts here, right? That is why Ireland needs to protect itself, and of course, the cables and energy and all of these other, kind of tertiary things around, supporting this FDI-based economy. Are the key arguments here. But yeah, I think at the very least in terms of the physical, the thing that they kind of point to as being particularly vulnerable, right? And then I guess the obvious point there then is, isn't this what makes Ireland vulnerable then, right? Isn't this something that Ireland should think about and perhaps question if, Ireland is a neutral country, right? And but we're hosting, for example, Israeli military targeting data, in Microsoft data centers, potentially Amazon Web Services and Google data centers through Project Nimbus and things like this, right? Isn't that then something that Ireland needs to consider as already a violation of neutrality and something that renders Ireland vulnerable? And what we're seeing, and Paddy and I have written about this with our colleague Rory Rowan as well, it comes up in the report we wrote with you, Paulie, that this is actually seen as an opportunity, right? In the context of what we were kind of saying earlier as well, where this developing military economy in Europe, right? Ireland actually sees this base, this FDI base, and specifically the technical capacities there as something that can actually be built on, right? And actually can be seized as an opportunity to, render itself, actually extremely important as a kind of infrastructural base, as a manufacturing base for dual-use technologies, and as a resource hub, right, for developing these things, right? At the very least, this is what's sold as, the next step in this FDI national, development model.
But I think it's important when we started writing the book. So it was before Russia-Ukraine war. It was before October 7th, and it was before certainly what's happening with Iran and the US. So I think that one way to kind of step back, because there's lots of connections around the neutrality, I think that particularly since October 7th and Palestinian solidarity and the movement around that, it has brought to the surface how Ireland is enmeshed in these global circuits of finance, of data, and of logistics, like military logistics with Shannon. And they were already there, and they have been developed over, as we try to write in the book, over decades. But it's been brought to the surface because of these movements pushing. So, for example, Ireland is Israel's largest second largest export partner. That was a report that came out by Al Jazeera. That's shocking. It's like, how does that happen? It's not because Irish people are buying loads of Israeli potatoes. You know, it's happening because of this intra-company trade. So it's Intel, largely. Intel has their campus in Kiryat, just north of Gaza, and the one in Leixlip we've already mentioned. And that is all about Ireland's sort of financial model and an economic model that ties us into these circuits. And so what that means is, at a time where there is this sort of geopolitical hardening and stakes, what we see in Ireland is Ireland, despite popular support, say, for Palestine, the Irish government not taking action because it is so dependent on US foreign direct investment, and as part of that, links to Israel and other sort of US partners. So we see Shannon Airport doubling down on Shannon as a military transit for US warplanes. We see the airspace continuing to be, obviously the Ditch has been the one who's reporting on this. We see it with the Occupied Territories Bill not being passed. We see it with Central Bank selling Israeli bonds. And we see it with the subsea cable. So it's in all of these different ways, Ireland's sort of relationship with the rest of the world, or our ability to have an independent foreign policy or sovereign foreign policy, has been shown to be massively constrained by our economic dependency on the US. So that's where these links become important. And I think, I know that we're probably going to wrap up soon, but I think one thing that is important about bringing it back to this economic or material sort of scale is that we also see the contradictions of this FDI model in terms of the fuel protests and in terms of the lack of infrastructural provision. So it's not just a question of we support Palestine and we have solidarity with Palestine, and that's at a kind of a moral point, and that is constrained by this dependence on the US. We also see it in terms of cost of living, and in terms of people's ability to access housing, people's ability to access energy or renewable energy, any of these things. And I think the more that we can highlight the contradictions of that model in terms of cost of living, in terms of the costs of the model, not the benefits of the model, but the costs of the model and who carries the costs, the more chance we have of building some kind of space to think about an alternative. Because at the moment, there isn't a lot of space to talk about an alternative to the FDI model. It's still seen as sacrosanct, to borrow whoever that politician's words were. Yeah.
Do you want to say a bit on the price of prosperity before we finish up? It was a report that was published by Uplift, and the three of you were the authors. So I don't know if you want to say anything on that.
Yeah, we drew on the book that you guys wrote, and we drew on some of the reporting that the Ditch had done, and we came up with some new stuff as well to try and sketch out the political consequences of this dependency on multinationals, and how the modicum of sovereignty we have or had has been compromised. How our relationship to US corporations has fostered a situation where the government can be pressured by the US at the behest of Israel to not enact legislation that had passed through both houses of parliament and was supported by the general population. Now, I don't want to blame it entirely on that. I think there's also things like political cowardice at play, lots of different factors. But our dependency is a pressure point, and it's been a significant factor in what our policies towards Israel have been as it's embarked on a campaign of genocide in Palestine. We've had these very impressive sometimes speeches coming from politicians, but materially, when you start to go a little bit deeper, we see that we're facilitating what's happening.
Yeah. We had a line in it, which we deliberately chose, which was that the US has a de facto veto on Irish foreign policy when it comes to their interests, as with the OTB in Israel. And we chose that because the irony, it's not even irony, isn't the word, but the fact that the government is making this argument that removing the triple lock is about reclaiming our sovereignty from the UN, from the international system, is such a distortion of the reality, that it's hard to get your head around the kind of ways in which, like sovereignty is being deployed within these kinds of around these sorts of issues, when, as we like outline in that massive report, 15,000 words, to really show the ways in which what is really limiting our ability to have a sovereign foreign policy is this dependency.
A lot of the ways that we're being warned, if we don't militarize, Russia might violate our sovereignty. It's already being done by the US. I mean, could you imagine if the Russian ambassador sent a letter or an email to Micheál Martin and other senior members of government saying, put me in touch with your Attorney General, please, so we can make sure there aren't any unintended consequences for you passing this law, enacting this law that's supported by the population? People would say, that's absolutely disgrace. That's a disgrace. It's bullying and so on. But it's seen as the cost of doing business if it's the US ambassador.
And I think there's something to like the acceleration of these contexts over the last few years as well, right? Because just to bring it back to the book a little bit, we spend a lot of, again, we've written a lot of words around this recently. I think the report's actually like 25,000 words, and the book
no wonder
is
no one read
massive, right? It's these are huge. But again, it was because what we wanted was to kind of create these, the shorthand, right? Or shorthand, very, very, very long form reference points for these things. But in the book, where we take this back to is that, Lemass and Whitaker had some sense of probably misplaced, right? Maybe naive, or, probably not naive, right? That's probably the wrong word, but the very least strategic sense of national interests, right, in mind when they were developing this, kind of idea of liberalization by, industrialization by imitation, right? And as this developed over time, it was seen as, and Paddy, you sent a quote to me earlier from, I think it was the Jacobson book, J.K. Jacobson wrote a book in 1994 where he was kind of quoting, Fianna politicians in, 40s and 50s, saying basically that, this is a continuity of a development model that is based on a sense of sovereign development in the context of, again, kind of breaking with colonial dependency, developing, an independent nation state, right? Nation building as a process that's also about, kind of building an independent economy. And so looking back on that, right, and how this is still, we see this still embedded in, the kind of FDI nationalism that, gets peddled out still. It's, this is, in its most kind of crass and embarrassing ways, it's being expressed when Micheál Martin brings a bowl of shamrocks to the White House and, the humiliation ritual of St. Paddy's Day every year. But it's very telling that he goes to D.C. to meet with Trump. Trump bullies him, saying that Ireland needs to buy more, LNG from the U.S. in order to keep, the trade surplus happy. And then he goes to an Amazon-sponsored event to talk to big tech leaders, saying, we're committed to data centers here. We're committing to figuring out the energy system here, right? Where we see that, being expressed in such a crass way, right?
Yeah.
And then what said this word kind of step change, right? Where a lot of the reason why this is, kind of amplifying at the minute is because, Ireland is, this strategy is not under threat, but they're getting a little bit of pushback from the U.S. in terms of these protectionist headwinds, right? Where they're very much kind of looking at what's happening in Europe, right? In terms of militarization and Ireland's kind of base of infrastructure of, kind of economic, embedded, what do we call it? Embedded fixed capital or whatever, right? Around this U.S. FDI here as a way to kind of, embed itself, right, even further between, this kind of transforming U.S.-EU relationship, right, especially in the context of militarization, right? And I think in the report we very much get at, how this is being, obviously, leveraged by the U.S., how it's undermining even these arguments towards, sovereignty in Ireland, but then how that, gets kind of, leveraged really cynically as, no, this is actually about building more sovereign, right? This is about building Ireland's economic base even further by, further embedding ourselves. And it's just, it feels sort of head-wrecking until you get into some of this, economic, the kind of economic base to it, right? At the very least, I'm sort of a vulgar political, vulgar Marxist these days about these things. But
do you guys see these dependencies deepening going forward, or do you think that the Irish political class has some sense of them being extremely dangerous? For example, Micheál Martin went on this big trade mission to China, which, it's certainly a good thing, right? That we're going to be doing more trade with China and depend less on the US. To what extent do you think the political class might try and, to some extent, reduce these dependency, precisely because it manifests in these very, very crude and often embarrassing ways, like having to present shamrocks to someone like Trump?
I can't see. I think maybe because something that we're working on very much in the background, because you see this there's a lot of rhetoric now about sort of delinking in a European context, or reducing dependency on the US. This so-called transatlantic rift between the US and the EU, and the EU talking about developing its own military economy, its own AI industry, renewable energies. So it's had all these sort of policies and strategies that have launched in the last couple of years. But if you scratch beneath that, the sort of rhetoric of that, and also some of the investment, a lot of those strategies and policies are really about deepening dependency on the US infrastructures. So whether it's LNG, whether it's the cloud service providers, the big cloud service providers like Google, Amazon, or whether it's US arms and the kinds of technology that come with that, that is not breaking, that's deepening. And Ireland is a kind of a good example of where that all hits the ground in a very clear way, because we are trying to develop our own sort of defense tech industry. We are building an LNG terminal in Clare. We're massively expanding our data center sector or industry, at least the LEAP strategy that was launched in February. So even though there might be talk of these things, what's actually being developed, where there is effort on the part of the state to find solutions for, say, tech companies, to find ways of fast-tracking LNG terminals, those are infrastructures, contracts, actual material economic relationships that are only deepening and intensifying. So, I think that's where you have to look, and not what politicians are necessarily saying or sort of, a kind of gesturing towards.
Yeah.
Maybe with that we can put in the show notes the link to your report so that people can go and read it for themselves, the 22,000 words.
There's also a much shorter executive summary.
And we should probably maybe finish up with that, I think.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us,
thanks a million.
guys. Really appreciate you being here. From the bog to the cloud. Buy it, read it, and thanks again for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a million.
Thanks. Yeah.